Hi, this is Dr. Michelle Robin with Small Changes, Big Shifts, Building Rhythm and Resilience. And I believe if you'll change one thing a month, one thing for the next 12 months, you'll change your life forever. Thanks for joining me on the journey. Wow, welcome back to Small Changes, Big Shifts. We are on October 14th, recording live on day one of the Kindness campaign, 31 days to help shift what's going on. And I could not be more delighted. I've been meeting with Dr. David. We've had a couple Zoom conversations about this, and you are in for a special treat today. The good news is I'm going to get a break from asking a bunch of questions, and he's going to share the science of kindness with you today, once again on day one. I want to say thank you to all of you. We've had a phenomenal response. If you have not gotten day one's assignment yet, I could read it for you. We also have a thing out on Facebook, but we have had such a great response. Our email system, AWeber, is having trouble keeping up. But if you have not gotten your email by 6 p.m. tonight, I want you to personally send me an email, LinkedIn, Facebook, however you know how to find me, and I will get my team on it. They have been outstanding. So I want to give a shout out to Zach and Desiree and Emily and Bailey and the whole YWC team for the phenomenal job on this successful launch we've had. So, hey, here's day one's quote. You yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection. That's by Buddha. And the act of goodness today, or kindness, is choose one thing you can do today to be kind to yourself. And I'm going to probably go play some pickleball after this. So that's another thing I'm going to do to be kind to myself today. But today, joining me on the show is David Fryburg M.D. He's a physician and a scientist, an endocrinologist, who is president and co-founder of Envision Kindness. Think about that, Envision Kindness. He's going to show us with our vision what kindness looks like. A Connecticut-based nonprofit to reduce stress, listen in, promote positive interpersonal connection. The mission of Envision Kindness is accomplished by promoting kindness, compassion, joy, and love through the use of images of the same. We focus our efforts in stressful settings like healthcare, as both patients and healthcare providers experience a lot of stress, and boy, are they experiencing a lot of stress during COVID-19. That stress causes or worsens dis-ease. Envision Kindness has created a digital media program that can be streamed directly into waiting rooms and offices. The program, called EnSpire, has been studied in dentist offices. Within minutes, viewers were remarkably inspired, happier, calmer, and more grateful. Hey, sign me up for that. You can find out more about Dr. David Fryburg at www.envisionkindness.org. It will be in the show notes as well. Dr. David, welcome to Small Changes, Big Shifts.
Dr. Michelle, thank you so much for having me.
Well, first of all, I want to ask you a question before you get right into your presentation. Why are you so passionate about kindness?
It actually started with watching the news many years ago and realizing that the depiction of how people interact really wasn't true to what life is mostly about. And that there was a need to try to provide people with a balance and quality of life to connect better and feel better about their lives. And kindness was really just the way.
Well, you hit some key words there. On the show, we celebrate, guide, connect, which provide hope. And we're celebrating kindness, the Kindness campaign, and once again, launching it with you with our podcast this afternoon, and connection, and how do we really have deeper connections with ourselves and others. So I'm going to let you take from here. I've got a chance to have a little bit of a peek at your PowerPoint, and I am on pins and needles, excited to watch the show today.
Well, thanks very much. And again, I really appreciate being here and being able to help kick off your amazing initiative and the Kindness Challenge. I think that's terrific what you all are doing. And for everyone else, I'm a nerd. And so I love science. I've loved it since I was a kid. And what I'm going to show you is some of the background to try to understand why actually kindness is integral to our lives. So I'm going to share my screen, and you're going to see some slides.
So everybody just take a deep breath. That's part of being kind to yourself, breathing in, breathing out.
Now you should see a slide and this will go into presentation mode. So What you're looking at is a cartoon. I hope you're looking at it from a blog that I write that's published in Psychology Today called The Science of Kindness. And you could guess who the guy in the white coat is, because I used to be a university professor and I love to teach. And really what we're going to do is cover some of the key points. But in case you fall asleep, you got to go elsewhere, whatever, it's all really on this slide. The rest is detail. And then what I'm going to try to do is show you how kindness is integral to survival. It's part of our lives and that we need it intrinsically. And one of the things, this is the overview slide, so you'll get almost everything that you need from here, minus, of course, the detail and a lot of what I think are great images. But the top line point, if you had to remember anything, is that the notion that kindness is simply a conscious moral virtue that we can either choose or disregard, and it's only secondary to self-directed survival is not right. It's not a good way to look at it. The way to look at it, really from an evolutionary point of view, is that nature wanted us, and still not even past tense, wants us to be kind to one another. And really kindness here is connection, and you'll see that they're integral to one another. And the reason for it is that it's key to survival. And I'm going to show you why for a variety of reasons and how it's wound into our biology with the intrinsic goal to say it actually is a reflection of a balance. Our behavior is a reflection of our balance between being kind and giving and caring for others and our self-interest. And there are lots of examples for how that manifests, how that's baked into our biology. And nature doesn't do things by accident usually. There's a reason for all of this. So Darwin recognized this, and in fact, we are wired to respond, to be kind, and to respond to kindness. It feels good. It activates the brain's reward system. It makes us happy. And happiness, of course, reinforces more kindness. And you'll see that there's a deep biology and psychology that has import and relevance to survival, to how we select mates and feel romantically inclined or attracted to others, for stress reduction and healing, which is a point of emphasis. And that one thing that this baked-in system allows us to do is trigger it by seeing it. So simply seeing kindness, not necessarily or witnessing it, not being part of it directly, can uplift people, it can promote happiness, it can reduce stress, and promote connection. And it's possible, and we'll talk about that, to inspire people towards kindness on a broader basis using images, tapping into that principle. A lot of the slides you're going to see in images are from our collection. These are crowdsourced images from around the world of kindness and compassion and joy and love that we've been able to collect from over 120 countries. So, but this point of the slide is that there are allied concepts in kindness, and they include, as on the bottom, altruism, compassion, empathy, gratitude, forgiveness, volunteerism, and I'm sure you can think of one or two others. But really, I'd like you to wind or wrap kindness together with these others because they're really related to each other, and it's really about caring or thinking about others as and the greater self. So one of the major themes that you've already heard me opine on is that kindness is the default state of most living beings. This is an image actually from the Philippines. And the quote by the 19th century philosopher Robert Ingersoll is, "We rise by lifting others," which I find is oh so true. Now, as I mentioned before, we're wired to be kind. And again, look at the system. Look at how all of this is set up. If you can take a step back as I'm talking and think about it as nature maximizing survival of the species. That's what nature's goal is. Nature wants us to be able to survive well, reproduce, and create additional generations. And so this is a key piece of why we should be thinking about kindness as intrinsic to biology. So we're required, for example, for nurturing the young, right? So a parent, and a new mother, best example, might, if driven only by self survival and self care, would not regard or ignore her offspring. Here, though, we know that that's not true, that there's a natural instinct to care. The parent pays attention to the child. And this is a biologically driven, a hormone driven phenomenon I'm going to touch on in more detail in a second. If you look at toddlers, for example, like the two in the picture on the right from an elementary school in the US, toddlers naturally help. In study after study, for example, an investigator will drop a pencil, and the toddler, maybe 2-3 years of age, knows to pick up the pencil and hand it back to the investigator. Some even say that this behavior is observable in infants. And so what it does is it gives a bit more evidence to the fact that it's baked in, that we're wired. And then adding to that is look at multiple species. This is not just a human phenomenon. You could see it in non-human primates. You could see it in ants, bats, rats, dogs. Most species will manifest this. So what are the internal mechanisms, though, and to drive us that nature has to connect and care for one another? So there are reward mechanisms. So lean back and think about how it feels to connect to others in a positive way, like the nurse and this patient are doing on the right. Think of positive relationships that you have with your family and friends. How do you feel after you've helped someone? That feeling, that warm feeling and uplift, has been called the helper's high, or by psychologists, eudaimonia, elevation, excuse me. In the reciprocal, of course, is pain. And loneliness, as you may know, and like bullying and ostracism, is a very painful event. Losing a loved one is a painful event. Social isolation for the elderly or for those in prison are painful events. So nature is saying to us, we need to be able to connect and care for each other, and is providing us the reinforcement to do that by saying, okay, here's something that feels good, here's something that doesn't. So a little bit more about the physiology. So there are neurologic systems that we're imbued with, right? And many of them, I'm sure they are familiar to you in general. We could recognize and mimic facial expression, body language, and touch. We know what a smile means. We know what a frown generally means. We know when someone's shoulders are hunched, or they're have a closed hand in a fist or an open hand. We know what a gentle touch looks like. And that evokes responses and helps us interpret the actions of another. In addition, to that interpretation, there's empathy. So we have to be able, nature has given us the ability to feel what someone else is feeling, and then taking that a little bit further to compassion. That is, we can feel or understand the suffering of another and help us drive to commit an action to care for someone. And in the case of doing it selflessly, of course, that would be called altruism. And then finally, in addition to mimicry and the ability to feel and recognize what someone else is feeling, we've also got these mechanisms to spread emotions. So, and we're going to come to kindness is contagious, but for example, laughing, happiness, anger, they're all contagious. And so emotions spread. That is part of helping us feel and pay attention to what else is going on. And the other pieces of evidence that help support all of this as being wired or baked in include that when there are lesions, damaged areas in the brain, they can manifest as specific deficits in terms of empathy or compassion and how we view others. And as I mentioned before, some of these hormonal systems, oxytocin, which you may have heard of, also colloquially called the love hormone, really not only is important in bonding, as I was talking about maternal child bonding, but is also important to antagonize the response to stressors and promote social behavior and engagement. And there are other parts of that reward system, things called endorphins and endocannabinoids, that also play a role in how we relate to one another. Now, what I'm saying is actually not new, right? It's been recognized. You can see it in for many years in many religious texts or ancient texts or philosophy, like from Aristotle, but even more recently from scientists who had two key contributions and for whom also are misquoted. So the first on the left that you see is from Darwin, and Darwin is often misquoted with the notion of survival of the fittest. He, of course, wrote about in his first book, The Origin of the Species, about natural selection and the development of attributes or characteristics that allow an organism to survive, to reproduce. However, in his second book, because he had observed a lot of sacrifice in different animal species for one animal for another or for its community, had written in The Descent of Man that communities which included the most sympathetic or altruistic members would flourish best. That is, he had begun to recognize that sacrifice, that altruism, was a key component of survival. The other person I wanted to acknowledge is Adam Smith, who the father of modern capitalism, and you may be familiar with his book, The Wealth of Nations. But actually, before he wrote The Wealth of Nations, he wrote a book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And in it, which he subsequently revised after The Wealth of Nations again, described an inner voice that knows that we are all connected and we need to act in accord with it. In other words, care for one another, be generous with one another. So another aspect or some evidence about kindness, and its biology. So it turns out that it also affects mate selection. Again, we're in that same theme of survival and reproduction. So it turns out that nice guys don't finish last. So while physical attractiveness, for example, is important, particularly for an immediate reaction to a potential romantic partner, so is kindness. So in studies that were done, people who were rated as being kind or perceived through their generosity had greater interest in a partner for a long-term relationship. That is, potential partners are looking at profiles of people and they see that someone is more generous and they express, oh yes, they'd like a longer-term relationship. It also, though, turns out that being kind or perceived as kind changes ratings of attractiveness. And in this experiment, psychologists showed the same picture and description of a in this case, a young man. And one line was changed with he enjoys video games to he volunteers. Then they were asked to rate how attractive he was. Based on his volunteerism, his attractiveness scores also increased. And then the same thing is true with seeing generosity or having it expressed. So heterosexual men, and most of these studies, or all the studies that I know of, were done in heterosexual individuals. Heterosexual men who were being watched by women were more generous than when they were either not watched or watched by another man. And so what it said was that there was a predisposition for knowing that their attractiveness would rise. So taken together, this whole notion, why would nature do this? Why would we be wired? It's really that, again, it would be selecting a mate that would provide for the family. That's the key take-home point from these scientists. So how does it affect health? Well, it was hard to measure kindness, and I pondered this particularly as a physician. I was particularly interested in it because most of the indicators said, well, it should. But it's really hard to measure kindness. So one way to measure it is at least as an index of it, is to assess how much people volunteer. So it turned out, and it totally blew my mind when I learned this, that volunteers have death rates that are 20 to 40% lower than non-volunteers. And to give you perspective, this is a big effect. This is like clean to contaminated to clean water. This is major vaccination. This is important. And it occurred in multiple epidemiologic survey studies, which are studies that are just looking at a population and asking questions over time. So they're complicated observations. I don't mean to make this too simple, but it happens in study after study. So there's something that's very important in here, and it probably comes through this connection. In other words, if we're all wired to connect, I'm sure you've heard it said that we're social animals. And as social animals, we need, in general, to connect with others to varying degrees, of course, depending on those needs, but we still need, for the vast majority of us, to connect with others. Well, it turns out that social support, that positive interpersonal connection, buffers stress. And by buffering stress, what I mean by it is when a stressor, a negative event comes along or a challenge, we don't react to it as much. We have more resilience, and that resilience allows us to not have a deleterious effect from the stressor itself. This is a table. It's really not intended for you to read, but I've summarized this in a longer way, and there are all kinds of things that, for example, that I can't really go into, but there's a genetic basis to this. There's, we talked about partner selection, but we're really not going to be able to talk about caring touch as a way that de-stresses and promotes the health of individuals. The volunteerism we talked about. And so what I'm trying to do, though, is give you a sense of the bulk, the vast amount of support that nature really wanted us to be kind as a way to connect, care for us, and survive. So, of course, there's a lot of stress in our lives. Before the pandemic, people were already experiencing a lot of stress. They come from a variety of sources: one's health, family issues, financial issues, workplace issues. These have been assessed over years by several organizations. In fact, the US is tied for fourth place in a four-way tie amongst the most stressed countries in the world. But the key part about stress is that it causes or worsens disease. There's both mental and physical disease, and we'll talk about that a little bit. There's stress from also workplace, which is epidemic, and now with COVID, the stress has just been amplified because it, of course, affects all of those elements mentioned above. If you look at the proportion of people who are stressed, this is about workplace stress. The takeaway is about at least 25 to 30% of UK, US workers are experiencing a lot of stress, and this is at work. And that more, if you look at it from moderate stress to unsustainably high, is roughly 3/4 of individuals. It's also been estimated about the cost of stress, and I'm not talking, there's of course a dollar figure which varies from 120 to $300 billion per year, but there's also been a recent estimate that stress causes 120,000 deaths per year. And so in the EU, it also has the same effects, and that people burn out and employees are more likely to visit an emergency room. The point here is I'm not trying to get you stressed about stress, but rather show you the magnitude of it. These are some of the disorders. We can class them as both mental illness and physical illness as a way to separate them. And you can read this list down, but there's a lot of different disorders. And the problem is, and the complexity is, they tie together. A point that's worth mentioning is that also stress increases the risk of major infection. It increases progression of viral infections such as HIV, so that people who are more stressed, who have been infected with HIV, have a more rapid progression to AIDS than those who had lesser stress levels. And it all therefore raises the possibility of an increased susceptibility to COVID-19. The US obviously has a major problem with it, and there are several reasons for it, but one has to wonder how stress does play a role in it. So if we try to look at it pathophysiologically, and we start at the top, the stressor, that event, the health and personal health or cost of healthcare, loneliness, discrimination, bullying, etc., induce a stress response. The stress response is that internal response you may have heard is referred to as fight or flight. It activates our sympathetic, one part of the autonomic nervous system, that helps increase blood pressure, increases our heart rate, and affects immune function. But when this goes on too long, and then when mixed with what's somebody's genetic predisposition, what's their environment like, maybe they have fewer resources because they are impoverished, then it starts to manifest as disease. And these are the diseases, overlaps with what I was talking about earlier, but also has behavioral impact as people go to seek ways to try to lessen the stressors. Of course, some of them are untoward when they become excessive, is for alcohol or diet, smoking, exercise. And then, of course, they feed back. And so what happens here is a vicious cycle that in the end decreases quality of life and affects survival. So a major reason for stress, of course, is a struggle to find purpose and meaning. Because we've talked about the bottom ones, right? Breathing, food, enough water, finances, interactions, loneliness is in here. Then there's self-esteem, confidence, etc. Everyone ultimately, as described by Maslow and Frankl, who are psychologists in the 20th century, has to find ultimately purpose and meaning. We're all built that way. So money is necessary but not sufficient. So a job, a title, etc., can make us feel better, but it's not sufficient, and true meaning needs to be found. So all of these things are stressors. So the secret sauce of kindness, which I've referenced earlier, it's really all about connection. This is another cartoon from that blog. And if we just start with kindness up top, you can think the helper's high, that in being involved or seeing kindness induces that helper's high. The recipient feels value. The giver, and remember the giver often benefits more than the receiver, is an ancient piece of wisdom, creates connection. And this connection results in better health because of lower stress, more happiness, and a sense of meaning and purpose. They can get value and purpose from it. And then, in addition, they may mimic it and pay it forward. So again, it's contagious. So if kindness is a natural antidote to stress and a path to meaning and purpose, and this boy is the image taken by a wonderful photographer in Bangladesh. He's 4 years of age, and every time I look at it, it just is very striking to me. And he has that full smile, which is called a Duchenne smile, where his eyes widen as well as his mouth, and you can feel his generosity. So what can kindness do in the workplace? Well, of course, as we're connected better to one another and we say, okay, I value you and we're connected to each other, negative behaviors decrease, positive behaviors increase, like teamwork, caring for both internal and external customers. And all of this decreases stress, of course, and fosters meaning. And it's a way, if one's in business, to decrease turnover, increase productivity, and affect workers' engagement. So one of the other really neat parts of this is that it's not just doing kindness, but seeing it can tap into this innate quality to care for others. In addition to doing the acts of kindness, that seeing it has these positive and beneficial effects. It activates this reward response in the brain and changes behavior. It builds trust. And by this, help explain that when we see it, then we tend to replicate it. So we've done 2 studies in this regard. This is the first, some data from the first one of showing still images to 400 people. There are 100 people in each of these 4 groups. There's a group of negative images, neutral images, and positive images. And I'm going to focus on the positive and the kindness images. These are puppies in a basket, bunnies and flowers, etc. And kindness images, a sea of shaven heads with one face looking up, and it's a young man going for chemotherapy, and his friends shave their heads in support. A woman in distress on a dark stairwell being comforted by a police officer. So compared to the pretty images, kindness images made people feel much more joyous. You can see the difference here. We can forget about these for the time being. Grateful, hopeful, loving, optimistic, not listed here, markedly compassionate, and inspired. They also tended to decrease irritation and anger, and these people were actually pretty happy at the beginning of the study. So when we saw these results, we actually looked and said, okay, how do we get this to people on a regular basis? How can we uplift them and promote compassion and kindness regularly and not really require time because people are pretty busy? So we came up with the ideas, well, what if we can uplift people through these images and just deliver them in a way that's very engaging? So we had formed this nonprofit called Envision Kindness, in which we promote kindness, compassion, joy, and love. And I'll show you more about what the images do, but they're all pretty positive. But then what we really wanted to do is get people to be able to see them. And beyond social media, in which we put out images, another way is to stream them directly into more stressful environments where people can, benefit from them. So the images themselves, and this, as an aside, is a Sri Lankan great-grandmother who is giving a traditional massage to her new great-grandchild, incorporate them into video. And one of the settings, in the setting in which we're starting, is healthcare. Because obviously it is a very stressful environment where the patients are stressed, the docs, the nurses, other staff members are stressed. And so the intent is to help elevate everyone and then improve the nature of their encounter and improve their experience so that they can engage better in their healthcare. So, and I'm going to show you some data on it. But one of the things that we emphasize in here is diversity, because we like to show this from as many different perspectives as possible. So the intent in healthcare is to positively shift the medical care, emotional, and spiritual environment, enhance the experience for patients, for their families, and for staff, and really to provide, to create the patient-provider encounter and make it much more satisfying for both. So we did a study recently in a dentist's office. The intent is to make this as real-world as possible. It's a pediatric dental practice, and there were 50 participants of a mix between parents and staff. And they either watched 8 minutes of this video that we call EnSpire, and there are many videos, just to be sure it's said. And then, or they watched children's programming, which would have been playing routinely in the clinic. And afterwards, we asked them questions about how inspired you were, happy, etc. And what you could see on the right is a graph from the study, and that in response to the children's watching children's television, there was really no movement in how inspired they felt. But after watching 8 minutes of this video, there was a marked increase in feeling inspired or moved or touched. These were all questions that were asked. And they were happier, calmer, and more grateful. We also asked them we tried to assess generosity. And that is, everyone knew that they were going to get a $5 gift card for participating. And at the end of the study, they were asked, well, you can keep or claim the gift card, but or you can choose to donate it to a family in need that attends the clinic. And with a ratio of about 2 to 1, people who watched EnSpire, who watched Kindness, mimicked it and donated their cards compared to those in the control group. So what it said was that, okay, this is very interesting and really helpful, that there's a behavioral piece that can go along with the emotional shift that's occurring. And then most of the people who saw it wanted to keep it, the practice to continue it. It's really very simple, using technology to stream this in, just to say it. And then in addition to images, there's complementary content regarding quotes and humor and suggestions and animations. And if you're interested, you can see more on our website. So if EnSpire can positively change how people feel and behave in real-world settings, then we need to really try to share it with people, because it would be great to lift people up. It would be great to bring them together, and in a way that is automatic, that taps into something that nature built in, which is what explains why this response is so fast. And there are other benefits that can come from it. There are, for organizations that use it, of course. And one of the things that I like very much about this idea is that it's passive. We're not asking people to be kind. We're not saying that, people aren't kind. It's really about, how do we encourage them to be kinder, and do it in a way that's not judgmental, that doesn't have bias built into it, and basically says, can we lift all of us? Can we float all the boats, and by raising, creating that rising tide? There are other benefits that come from it in the clinic, from compassion, etc. And you can see more about that in the book called Compassionomics. So a key piece here, and relevant to the kindness challenge that Dr. Michelle and her group are running, is that kindness ripples outwards. So one way of thinking about it is the better it gets, the better it gets. So people see the kindness, they activate something called mirror neurons. That's this recognition system. They feel good. They have increase in joy and optimism and gratitude. And then they do kindness. And then other people see them with doing kindness, and then they perpetuate it. So people become the change agents. And so by using EnSpire from our perspective, these are like the drops in the pond. And then the ripple spreads out because people take care of it themselves, because it's natural. This is not forced. It's simply tapping into the way we are. So it has a lot of implications for promoting kindness and better health on a population scale. And in a world that seems to me to need a lot more collaboration and cooperation, and that we can get a higher quality of life at no cost, wouldn't that be great? So you yourselves are the ultimate judges. You can ask yourself, how do I feel after seeing the images? You don't have to worry about what I said or with data, etc. That can only support it. Look to yourselves, see how you feel, and then you know the answer. I'm going to end with two quotes. The first one is from FDR. Human kindness has never weakened the stamina or softened the fiber of a free people. A nation does not have to be cruel to be tough. And from Einstein, compassionate people are geniuses in the art of living, more necessary to the dignity, security, and joy of humanity than the discoverers of knowledge. So thank you very much. And Dr. Michelle, with whatever time we have left, I'm happy to take questions.
Well, great. I'll let you shut down that PowerPoint. I love some things you said. Can we encourage others to be kinder? And that not people, it's not that people aren't kind, is can we encourage them to be kinder? And I think that goes to the conversation we were having before we started today. I would remind our listeners that they could, find you at envisionkindness.org, also on LinkedIn, but also too, I would encourage them all to go to Psychology Today. If you just put Dr. David Fryburg with Psychology Today, you'll have all these great articles that'll come up. One of my personal favorite is Why Does a Hug Feel So Good? I'm not going to share it here because I'm going to save it for a little later because I am a hugger. Many of you know that. So just a couple questions. What has been one of the gifts that you've gotten as you've been studying this lifestyle of kindness?
I went to medical school to apply science and help people live a better life. Like so many other people like yourself went into a caring profession. And I've had a journeyman's career through academia and the pharmaceutical industry and now to here. And I look at this as such a blessing if it can be activated to help people attain a higher quality of life, and with it, better mental and physical health. I see a lot of solutions inside of here. And so that's probably the key piece for me.
Well, I'm going to tackle that. You said solutions inside of here, and I heard you say multiple times that it's free. It's not like it's a $100 drug that you have to get. It's not that you have to drive across town to a certain provider.
Yeah.
Did you try to? You drove that home during the talk that this is free. So
well,
take that
if you
home with it just
when
for
you
a
think
minute.
about it, even smiling at someone, holding the door, small acts of kindness in my view, and I think of many others, add up. And so we talk about ways of changing lifestyle and benefiting one another. And so those are no cost. And compared to the cost of therapies, because once you have the problem, it becomes harder to get rid of it. So preventing it is the source. Is that address your question?
It does, and I want to reiterate. You called yourself this. I didn't, but I love a good science nerd. So thank you for bringing the science to this movement as we launch it today. And these active goodnesses, as simple as smiling, as waving hello, and I'll tell some stories as we go along these 31 days as what has shifted me. And the other thing you said that is back in my mind, you talked about genetics, and one of my friends, Dr. Jay Dunn, who's a genetic expert or studies genetics, and who's an expert these days, right? And I remember when she read my genetic, she said, "You know what? People probably say you're kind." And so, can you talk about that at all? About how does it genetically?
That I'm not sure what she's referencing. And the genetics that I was referring to before are largely population genetics. There are some studies on this receptor for oxytocin and something called polymorphisms, changes in the sequence of or structure of these receptors that affect responsivity. But that becomes a bit more speculative. So I'm sorry, I'm a little bit at a loss.
Well, I need to get my two science nerds together. That would be fun. And so, once again, thank you so much for saying yes and joining me today. I have thoroughly loved. I feel like I've been in a CEU class. Do you think I can get a credit for this? If only. Would it be great if you get credits for actually this stuff is so great. Once again, you can follow this movement at envisionkindness.org. Dr. David Fryburg, thanks for joining me. Is there anything last you'd like to share before we close the show?
I wish you all I wish you all well. We need a big injection of kindness to help heal our country as well as a lot of the rest of the world.
Well, we're going to create a ripple from the heartland, and all of you are part of it. So thanks for joining me on this movement. As I mentioned at the beginning, if there is something, if you have signed up for the campaign and you have not gotten day one by, say, 6 p.m., I would love for you to shoot me an email, a direct message on LinkedIn or Facebook. And hey, I'll get on my team. We'll figure out where that's hiding and get you all hooked up into all the companies. I want to tell you, really, very few companies. There's been a couple that just couldn't fit it in their bandwidth right now. To everybody from the Locktons, the Cerners, the Garmins, and all these different companies, the school districts around Kansas City who have said, yes, we are going to jump on this bandwagon. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Hey, I'm sending you all really big hugs. And hey, in the next few days, I'm going to share Dr. David's link on why does a hug feel so good. All right, I'm sending you all big heart hugs. Hey, and I'll chat with you next week.
Bye, Dr.
I sure appreciate you listening to Small Changes, Big Shifts. If you go to the website, smallchangesbigshifts.com, we'll have the show notes ready for you there. If this episode inspired you to make a small change that will lead to a big shift, please share with a friend. You can catch our episode on Apple, Google, Spotify, YouTube, and our website. And if you feel like it, please leave a rating or a comment. Be sure to subscribe so you can catch our episode next week. Blessings to you.